This is Cold Star, Tales from the Spine, where the Milky Way meets Andromeda. One voice. One stubborn crew. Keep your coffee, if you can. My name is Ned Vallon. We learned a useful truth after a lifetime of dumb choices and clever repairs: the universe will always give you an education, usually via heat, hunger, or humiliation. This episode is the humiliation version dressed in a survival manual. It begins with a clever ambush and ends with me listening to a transmitter we built out of animal guts and magnetite while Mika roasts something that vaguely approximates coffee. It is the kind of night that tells you who you are when the sky goes away. We were running low on plasma reserves after the Avernus run, the kind of low that makes calculations urgent and drives captains to consider options they would normally call questions for later. A contact in New Valparaiso offered a quick top-up, a private depot on the rim of a small, wet planet in the Eos fringe that traded in salvaged reactor droplets and reclaimed propellant. Payment was cash up front and discretion, delivery was easy and off books. The ship hummed with the pleasant arithmetic of fuel traded for credits. I liked the sound of it. Less math, more sleep. An honest night, or so it promised. The planet was a blue-green smear on the screen, called New Trinidad on colonial charts because someone had once liked that name and the ring had stuck. Its gravity was kind and its atmosphere heavy with warm salt. The depot sat under a sky like a bruise, a scattering of platforms and skiffs clustered like gulls around an offshore refinery. We lowered a tender and met the manager, a man with a face that said he'd negotiated with storms and lost more than he'd kept. He loaded 3 sealed canisters labeled Plasma A and wished us safe passage. We were not alone. Shadows hung among the rigs, cutters and skiffs that do not belong to licensed traders but to people who prefer their business unrecorded. The Kalari had shown us a professional courtesy earlier, a sliver of mutual benefit, but the spine rewards initiative with new predators. Tonight the predators belonged to a band called the Rookline, a coalition of humans and 2 other races, a bristled, tank-shouldered species called the Corv and a slippery, multi-tentacled species called the Leth. They didn't care about honor, they cared about profit and momentum. We should have left as soon as our tender rose. Instead, Tor argued a local side job, Enric flirted with margin details, Mika double-checked seals, and Lise balanced the receipt against the manifest. We delayed long enough for a shadow cutter to slide in like a stone in a river. They moved elegant and fast, a classic Rookline ambush, 1 cutter out front, a lure in the middle, and a pair of grapplers downwind. Argus, the leader called, human voice wrapped in a Corv rasp. Care to share a portion? We prefer in hand presently. I smelled the geometry of a theft. Tor hissed through the calm that the Rookline had a history of using people's patience as currency. We tried to talk. Negotiation is a craft. So is lightning. The Rookline practiced the second. The fight was quick and unromantic, we were outnumbered, and their grappler snagged a canister. The Corv brute slapped a line and jerked it into their hold. One of the Leth used a bioadhesive to stick a ram arm to our tender and pull a second canister before Mika could unspool a safety tether. By the time we'd cleared the dock, and that's when survival starts telling you its terms: you're not pushing away from the shore, you're being left on it. The tender was damaged in the snatch. We limped down into orbit and then down further, because the hull would not take the stress without fuel to charge the attitude thrusters. I made the worst professional decision a captain can make and set a course for the nearest gravity well. The Argus could not risk the jump without the canisters. We would drop to the planet and figure it out. The crew agreed, because agreement is cheaper than mutiny. We came down through a sky that smelled like brine and copper, and the tender broke free in a way that made every instrument scream. We crash-landed on a tidal plain close to a brackish mangrove, trees that moved like sleeping fingers. The hull sat in mud and salt and the plasma level read an ugly 0. The Rookline's tracks ended in a cloud of dust and 2 disappearing wake trails. They had gone hungry but not merciful. Stranded means small decisions become large: can you move, can you breathe, can you feed people? We took stock. The Argus had 3 days of rations if rationed like a funeral. The hull had a gash and a busted pump that would take parts and time. Comms were offline beyond local chatter. The crew, for all their newness, was steady enough. Mika's hands worked like prayer, Lisa's eyes read telemetry as if it were scripture, Tor's black book of favors felt thin and suddenly irrelevant, and Rick argued prices at a half-beat even when there was no market. The planet, I learned, was not unkind, just indifferent. Life had found routes to squeeze energy from tides and lightning and the rich mineral soup. Our first real discovery came in the form of a small creature that Mika christened a Voltbody, a squat, segmented worm about the size of a loaf, its skin dappled with crystalline nodes that sparkled faintly in twilight. It stored charge in a layered organ like a battery and fed on ionic algae. The local hunters called them gleamworms. They were edible if you boiled. The second useful thing was the mangrove's root system, which exuded long fibrous cords embedded with conductive salts. The cords were strong, flexible, and naturally water-resistant, perfect for improvised wiring. The locals used them as ropes and for crude signals between the roots, old-world tech made organic. The third was magnetite nodules near a shallow vent field a hike away. We discovered them when Mika went to scout and came back waving her hands like a child with a new toy. Magnetite, she said, words that to an engineer are the equivalent of prayer. The planet had embedded iron crystals near the vent seams, they were noisy on a sensor and heavy in the hand. We could live off gleamworms and salt pockets, but surviving is not just about calories. It's about morale and movement. We salvaged blankets and the tenders salvaged tools. We used the mangrove cords to rig a shelter and the Argus's life raft fabric to make a windbreak. Lee set up a ration plan that was surgical and human at the same time. Tor walked the periphery and convinced a small band of friendly scavengers, locals who called themselves the Turners, that a mutual non-aggression for a share of repair parts was a better deal than letting the Rook line take everything. Enric traded a pack of watch gears for a crude set of bone needles. He later embroidered survival slogans in a pain script. The first week was a school in boredom and resourcefulness. Mika taught us to cook glimmerworm stew, salt, kelp, and a dash of duct tape humor, and I learned that coffee substitutes can be made by roasting a fibrous root that produces a bitter but warming cup. It was not the coffee of memory, but it did the job. We scavenged crystal nodes and magnetite, cleaned pipes, and salvaged circuit boards from our tender. We jerry-rigged a small thermal condenser from the tender's radiator and an old COM capacitor. The Argus was a patient. Building a transmitter out of wildlife sounds like a punchline. It became our plan. The local animals had evolved to use the planet's ionic chemistry for communication. Gleamworms could be coaxed into synchronized discharge by a pattern of light and touch. Some mangrove roots acted as resonant antennas, their conductive salts carrying long, low-frequency vibrations through wet soil. The Turners had an old trick, they'd bang on mangrove trunks with hollow bones to send a simple signal across the plain. It occurred to Mika, who is nothing if not audacious, that if you could harness gleamworm discharge and feed it into magnetite resonators, you could create a coherent, pulsed waveform. With enough amplification, you could send a narrowband ping into space. We went about building it like a mad choir. Step 1, collect gleamworms. Step 2, breed them into synchronized discharge by gently tapping their crystalline nodes in time with a small metronome built from a salvaged motor. Step 3, harvest mangrove fibers for wiring and make crude capacitors from hollowed shell sections lined with magnetite dust. Step 4, build a resonant cavity by stacking magnetite nodules into a parabolic bed and coupling the charged discharge through the fibers. There was science and there was folklore in the method. The science said, piezoelectric-ish crystals plus ionic discharge plus resonance equals narrow radio emission. The folklore said, if you sing to the worms, they sing back louder. We did both. Mika learned to read the gleamworm's mood. She could calm them with a low wind and excite them with a bright rhythm. Lise turned her calculations into a pump schedule. If you feed them every 15 seconds and dump heat into the resonator in the right phase, you get a pulse that carries. The building was messy and full of minor catastrophes. A gleamworm once singed my sleeve when it overdischarged because I tried a ruder rhythm. Tor insisted on a safety shuttle, then promptly used it to swap out barter goods. Enric kept trying to sell the idea to a passing trader as bioresonant broadcast tech, which made the Turners laugh and the traders back away slowly. We called the device the Argus Beacon because we are unimaginative and sentimental in equal parts. It was a squat stack of magnetite, woven mangrove fibers, a jar of gleamworms in a thermally regulated holder, and a salvaged dish from the tender attached via a salvage arm. When we first pulsed it, the planet answered with a chorus, the worms blinked like a field of lanterns, the mangrove hummed, and the magnetite sang like a struck bell. My throat tightened in a way that almost felt like prayer. We tuned the pulse to an old cartographer's handshake pattern, a long, slow 2-beat followed by a quick triple burst. We broadcasted that pattern into the dark and then built a simple receiver with a magnetite crystal tuned to the return frequency. It was low-band and ugly, but when Rakiz's cutter had been near the planet earlier, Lees had noticed a faint echo signature in the logs that matched a relay standard used in the fringe. We hoped the Kalari or a passing merchant might pick it up. Hours passed. The beacon pulsed. The worms dimmed. Our hands were inked in salt and magnetite dust. Then the receiver sparked. At first only static, then a carrier wave, then a voice, a busted, faraway voice that took a few breaths to shape into words. It was not a merchant or a pirate. It was Julia's ledger woman from New Lisbon, someone Tor had made a friend of earlier. She'd been running tracks and had a contact in a salve. We arranged a pickup at dusk 2 nights later. It wasn't clean. It required us to keep the beacon silent and mimic a natural resonance to hide the ship's direction. Rakiz's acquaintance, a small trader with a conscience and an itch for credits, took the bait and brought 2 canisters at a neutral point. We traded smoke, fish leather, and a promise of neutral parts. When the canisters touched Argus's hold, it felt like a small miracle and a bureaucratic victory. We patched the hull, boosted the tender where we could, and left the marsh with a composition of relief and exhaustion. The Rookline remained in the belts, richer by plasma and poorer in karma. The Turners and Julia kept their favors, which is to say they would call them when needed. The gleamworms went back to their quiet bulbs, and Mika kept one tiny one in a jar as a ship pet. We named it Glimmer, and it glowed faintly like a small, honest star. On the ride out of atmosphere I sat on the jump console and sipped the root brew that passes for coffee. The taste was thin and alive with salt, the way someone smiles at your bad joke. I thought about how we had turned the planet's life into circuitry and then used that circuitry to call friends. It felt ridiculous and deeply right. We had been stripped of modern convenience and taught to improvise. The lesson was old: ingenuity beats paperwork most nights. We left New Trinidad with a dented hull, a restored fuel line, and a beacon in the hold that hummed faintly when the power cycles ran, a reminder of how fragile and resourceful we were. Prometheus would hear the rumor. Rakiz would note us as competent troublemakers. The Argus had survived another test. I recorded a short log and hid it in the ship's archive. We were stranded. We learned to live off the land, and the life there taught us to sing. We built a radio out of living things and iron, it answered. If you ever need us, listen for the long 2-3 quick. We will be there. Mika roasted a gleamworm for her genius coffee and handed me a cup. It tasted like victory and a little like seawater. I drank and felt the crew around me, flawed, stubborn, and quietly heroic in small ways. Survival had stitched a seam across us you can't buy. It was something like family. End. Everything went decently until the Ketheri got involved. Vailish, remember him, had a less than legal habit of ferrying people across back routes when asked politely with good credit or polite conversation. He'd been owed a favor. He arrived with a small skiff that hummed like a pleased insect and announced that he'd be taking a passenger, Ned Valen. He hopped aboard, and in 3 silent beats we were cutting a path between ship hulks. Now, there is a certain absurdity to hitching a ride while your name is trending for exposing corruption. The skiff had curtains that looked like someone had tried to upholster a cloud. I sat and tried to look calm while the outside world managed not to be calm at all. For reasons I do not fully understand, Baelish decided to hum a little. Ketheri humming is like a musical shrug, it is comforting and unsettling in equal parts. Halfway through our exit, a Corpi drone, one of those administrative automatons dressed in grey, decided that the skiff looked suspicious and triggered an approach. The skiff's engine hiccuped, Baelish made a noise that translated roughly to "Oh, spice," and Mika, in an act of brave absurdity, tossed a bag of grease at the drone. The grease was intended to gum up a hinge. What it actually did was coat the drone's identification plates with a film of black oil and render its facial recognition cache into chaos. The drone mistook the reflection for a philosophical crisis and spent 7 minutes pondering its identity while chirping polite existential questions. It was genuinely moved by its own confusion. This afforded us another window. We slipped to New Lisbon where Julia had slid our names into a ledger labeled "Exhibits of Local Color." She handed us disguised papers and a small, ridiculous uniform for me, the hat returned, a badge that said "Artifact Handler," and a printed permit that claimed we were responsible for maintaining an ancient statue of a forgotten saint. The permit was stamped by a county office that either loved bureaucratic humor or had fallen asleep on the job. For once, the universe's indifference worked for us. But our respite was not permanent. Director Calidus took personally to humiliation and escalated from emissaries to a minor fleet of official boats that smelled like lemon and enforcement. He sent a public notice that hinted the "artifact handler" was a smuggler and attached a picture that resembled me in the hat, because of course it did. The harried citizens of New Lisbon, who enjoyed a spectacle and who also enjoyed their own privacy, decided they didn't like the Corpi policing their business. A small uprising of civic annoyance ensued, mostly consisting of people shouting poetic insults at drones and throwing stale pastries that had been rejected by the market bakery. It was surprisingly effective. The chase across the spine in that month resembled a bad touring production. We performed in New Venice, slept in New Reykjavik, learned that no one checks a person who looks like a retired furniture appraiser. We made mistakes. Tor accidentally recruited a courier gang who insisted on formal introductions and solemn toasts, which involved a lot of ceremonial drinking that left Tor with a headache and more favors than he deserved. Enric adopted a parrot that mimicked Director Calidus and caused a minor paperwork riot when it squawked, "Audit," in the middle of an open market. But the funniest and most human moment arrived when we finally had to meet Calidus face to face. He arranged a hearing on neutral ground, Helios Station, where the lights are honest and the chairs are too stiff. We were to attend under a summons. I considered running. Mika considered hiding. Tor considered pleading. Enric considered bribing the station's potted plant, which he seemed to think had authority. We did attend because pride and curiosity are combustible. Also, I was tired of being dramatically misinterpreted on trending feeds. In the hearing, Calidus sat behind a desk that had a plaque, "For the People." He read out a list of accusations that were impressively dull and remarkably long. The room smelled of official coffee and a little bit of melted plastic. At the front of the gallery sat a small Ketheri delegation and a Sarnik dock crew who had owed us favors. They did not come for violence, they came for an interesting voice to mock if things went poorly. When my turn came, I spoke plainly and too honestly, which is exactly the style that makes certain officials uncomfortable. I could have presented evidence in measured clauses. I could have filed items in triplicate. Instead, I told a story, about small people who lost their harvests to contracts dressed as research grants, about the way Prometheus winners sometimes left communities worse off. I used names. I used receipts. I used a line in the transcript where I read an email from a Prometheus liaison that described a donation as a strategic investment. It was the theater of honesty. Calidus sputtered. The legal committee blinked. Prometheus's legal rep smiled in that particular way measured to be photographed with. And then an unexpected thing happened. The Ketheri delegation stood and hummed in unison, an ancient form of choir that, in their culture, indicates deep approval. The Sarnik front row muttered in guttural agreement. Two human members on the committee, one from New Lisbon and one from New Valparaiso, cleared their throats and asked simple, disarming questions that exposed holes in Calidas's narrative. What started as an attempt to humiliate me turned into a messy public accounting. Calidas found himself on the defensive. The Corpi realized their tidy badge had been shoved into the messy gears of public opinion. A hearing that was meant to be a show trial became an uncomfortable town meeting. Calidas gave a speech about protocol and decorum and the rule of law that was thin with sincerity. He did not resign on the spot, but the photographic record of his forehead sweating did wonders for certain paper trail pursuits. We did not get a clean victory. Nobody stages a perfect clearing in our part of space. But the hearing produced two important results: Calidas's office was put under review, and Prometheus's ostentatious donation to one small village was registered as questionable spending. More importantly, the story made it harder for bureaucrats to hide behind their own polished press releases. It made people remember that names and receipts mattered. And because none of life is purely noble, there was also a comedic moment when Enric's parrot, who had been smuggled in under a gifted blanket, squawked, "Audit," at the precise moment Calidas attempted a dramatic pause. The room laughed, which was lethal to a tightly staged humiliation. Laughter is a public metal detector for bullshit. In the aftermath, we did what fugitives do when the dust settles: we drank. We drank with Ketheri colors and Sarnik sea smoke, with human spirits and a ridiculous fermented pastry wine Julia insisted we try. The mood was warm and ridiculous. Tor promised to never again recruit a courier gang without a vetting ritual. Mika promised to calibrate jump vectors less with intuition and more with schematics. Enric apologized to a potted plant he tried to bribe. I promised to keep the flask where it belonged, inside a locker, behind a promise, and occasionally in my hand when a night required courage. So yes, I ran from the government for exposing corruption. I also made a spectacle that annoyed a director, made friends who hummed when you told the truth, and collected favors that bite time in the spine. It was messy. It was funny. It cost us herbs, because Julia's pastry wine required rare spice, and it bought us noise, an important commodity if you're trying to keep a ship flying while powerful people tidy their desks. If you ask whether I'd do it again, I'd say, with better disguises and fewer parrot incidents, yes. The spine tolerates bluntness when it comes wrapped in humor and a chorus of unlikely allies. And when the ledger times come due, you want a crew who will argue over the bill and then show up with duct tape and laughter. End.